Grace, we have some slides and I'd love you to go through that with us, talking about how the Pearson PTE is different from the IELTS exam. So we're going to start with the Pearson PTE. Grace is going to be talking us through over the next three slides how the Pearson PTE is different from the IELTS. And then Brian is going to talk about how the OET is different to the IELTS over the next three slides. Go ahead, Grace.
Thanks, Tanya. Okay, so as you can see from the graphic here, the main difference, or one of the biggest differences between PTE and IELTS, is that the PTE is entirely computer-based. So there is no human interaction during the test whatsoever. So whereas, for example, in the IELTS test, the speaking part is done as an interview with another person, with an examiner, the PTE is different because you speak into a microphone, the computer records all of your answers, and all of your answers are assessed by artificial intelligence. So some people might prefer to take the PTE because of that lack of human interaction, if they prefer just a computer-based test. But of course, both options are available for IELTS as well. Another difference, which I think Meredith did talk about earlier, is the amount of time it takes to register, take the test, and get your results. So as you can see here, the registration time for PTE is only 48 hours before. So you can register for the exam 48 hours in advance, take the test, and then your results are delivered within 2 days. So whereas the IELTS, it's a little bit longer, it's about 3 to 5 days for the computer-based test, or up to 13 days if you take the paper test, the results for PTE are delivered relatively quickly. Another difference between them is that they are scored a little bit differently. So those of you who are familiar with IELTS will know that they have a scoring system from 1 to 9, whereas the PTE uses a score range of 10 to 90, sorry. So actually they do break down the scores a little bit more in PTE to get quite specific numbers coming out of that. Let's see what else. Oh, another difference is that the PTE is a little bit shorter at 2 hours, and that is taken in one sitting, whereas the IELTS is a bit longer at 2 hours and 45 minutes, and the speaking test is done separately and can actually be scheduled on a different day. So really we can see, if we look at the differences, that the PTE does seem to be a much quicker process in some ways. And then if we look here at the sections, so we can see that IELTS has 4 subtests. It's divided into reading, writing, listening, and speaking. Whereas the PTE, it's 3 tests. So speaking and writing is done together, and then we have reading and listening. And one thing I would mention about the PTE is that some of the sections test integrated skills. So that means that you might be doing the listening section, but you're actually being tested on your listening and your writing perhaps. So PTE does have that integrated skills element, whereas IELTS just tests one skill at a time. Let me just see. I think I've talked about everything on this slide. I don't know if there was any more information.
I think, yeah, I think we've got everything here, Grace, on the difference between the IELTS and the PTE. Let's move to the next slide, and Grace can maybe take us quickly through the difference in terms of the other parameters for the IELTS and PTE.
Right. So yes, if we think more about the exam content, then IELTS and PTE are relatively similar in that they both contain academic content, and you're practicing and demonstrating your use of English in real life academic context. So in that respect, they are quite similar. And I'll let Brian talk about how OET is quite different in that respect. Now, the scoring requirements, I can see a lot of people have been asking about the scoring requirements in the chat. So with IELTS, if you are familiar with that, you are required to get an overall score of 6.5 with a 7 in speaking. If we take a look at PTE, it's requiring an overall score of 55, but also saying no section below 50. So you do get an individual score for each section, as well as an overall score, So these are the scores that you would be required to achieve. Now, I think we've talked about the human interaction. So yes, in IELTS, you do have to actually speak to a person. If you prefer not to do that, then PTE might be for you because your speaking skills are assessed by a computer. Now, the remarking policy. So if after you've taken your test, you want to get a section remarked, with IELTS, you can request remarking within 6 weeks, of the test date. Whereas for PTE, it's within 14 days of receiving your results. So just make sure that you're familiar with those policies for the exam that you're taking. And finally, who is it for? Well, the IELTS is traditionally considered to be quite a comprehensive test of your English, and it is widely accepted by many institutions worldwide. I would say that PTE might be better for you if you prefer a relatively short and entirely computer-based test that you take in one sitting. But as Meredith did say earlier, I would highly recommend that you take a look at both of them, have a go at a practice test and see which format you prefer, because really you're the one who's got to make this decision at the end of the day.
Yeah, it really is a very individual decision. And keep watching, everybody, because we have our blog on the Connetics USA website that you can download, talking about the differences between the IELTS, the OET, and the PTE. And next week, we're going to have a checklist for you, which will give you some questions to ask yourself, because it's going to be your decision, as Grace says, which is going to be the best fit for you. Before we move on to the OET and how that differs from the IELTS, and Brian's going to take us through that, Grace, we have one more slide, just finishing off the Pearson PTE. If you can just share with us just some of the options of the test centers and cost and payment.
Okay, yes, there have been so many questions in the chat, in the comments, about the more logistical aspect. So as you can see, IELTS has got a large number of test centers, 1,200 centers in 140 countries. PTE has 250 test centers worldwide. When you compare these numbers, you can obviously see that IELTS does have more test centers, but I wouldn't let that put you off the PTE. Do your research and find out where your nearest test center is, because there might be one very close to you. The cost of the exam, you can see, is quite similar. So $218 or $220 for the IELTS, $220 for the PTE. So very similar in that respect. And payment options for the IELTS would be a bank deposit or credit card, whereas for PTE, it just accepts credit card. So there you can see the more logistical side of the exams, and I do hope that that helps answers all of those questions in the chat.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions about those exact topics. So hopefully everybody, these charts will give you a better idea of how these exams differ. So Brian, let's talk a little bit more about the OET and the mechanics of the OET. We're going to put that slide back up and start with the first slide, which will talk about the overall differences between the IELTS and the OET. And Brian's going to take us through that now.
Well, generally, IELTS and OET are not very different when it comes to the receptive skills, particularly for listening and reading. They're also very similar when it comes to the type of examinations, because we have IELTS on paper and IELTS on computer. And just the same in OET, we also have OET on paper and OET on computer. So there's a computer delivered version and also a paper edition for both IELTS and the OET. So very similar to each other, unlike the PTE, which is only computer delivered. Now, when it comes to the registration time, you need to register for IELTS at least 4 days prior to your examination. IELTS is in high demand, so there are a lot of people who are taking IELTS, whereas for OET, there are not really a lot of test dates, so you have to book your examination at least 3 weeks ahead for you to secure a slot or an appointment for the test. So in that regard, IELTS is actually something that you can more easily book in comparison to OET, because you will have to wait 3 weeks before you can book another examination for OET. There's also quite disadvantages when it comes to resitting, because you will not be able to resit the examination as soon as possible if you want to get your test results much faster. Now, for the test validity, at least for IELTS and OET, they're both valid for 2 years. PTE is also valid for 2 years. So I think all of the English examinations, including TOEFL, are valid for 2 years. So there's not really much difference here. And when it comes to the exam duration, this is actually where it differs. IELTS is for 2 hours and 45 minutes with a 15 or 11 to 14-minute speaking test, whereas the OET is for 3 hours with a 20-minute speaking component. Now, what's different is that sometimes in IELTS, you will have to take the examination on two separate occasions. Sometimes you have to take the examination on 2 separate days, one for your speaking test and one for your written exams, particularly for paper delivered IELTS. Whereas when you're taking computer delivered IELTS, sometimes you have to take everything in a single sitting. And in OET, usually the test is administered within a day. So everything happens within a single day. Usually the morning sessions will be for listening, reading, and writing, and the speaking component will be in the afternoon. Now, the score ranges from 1 to 9 for IELTS, 9 being the highest and 1 being the lowest. But for OET, it's between 0 and 500. And actually, there are letter equivalents for the numerical scores that you're going to be given in OET. At least for the US, the requirement is somewhere close to B and C plus. So that's between 300 and 340 for C plus, and 350 and above up to 440 will be a B. So I think that's a little complicated because they have the numerical scores and they also have the letter scores. Okay, so you just have to convert your score to the letter scores so that you will know whether you qualify for the US. For the sections, there are actually 4 sections in both the IELTS and the OET, quite different from the PTE, in which there are integrated components. For IELTS and OET, they're very similar. Listening, reading, writing, and speaking are the 4 components of the test. But I would have to say that the difference here is the context. I'll talk about that in a bit. The listening and reading tests of IELTS and the OET are very similar to each other. The writing and speaking components are a bit different. Now, the availability of the test results will be within 13 days prior or after, sorry, your paper delivered IELTS test, or 3 to 5 days, much faster for the computer delivered test. But for OET, it's between 14 and 16 days usually. So it's a bit longer compared to the amount of time that you will have to wait for your test results to be released for IELTS. Yeah, let's continue to the next slide.
Moving on to the next one.
Yeah. This is actually where it differs largely, I would say, because IELTS is a general exam. So it can be in the academic or social context or an everyday kind of context, in which the kinds of passages or listening recordings that you will be encountering are very relatable, because they're probably things that you'll get to hear or read when you're already outside the country, living in a foreign country. Whereas in the OET, everything is medical related or in the healthcare context. This might actually be advantageous to people who are exposed to the medical environment, because definitely they can relate better to the passages and to the extracts. And they will find it a bit more interesting, in my personal opinion, because the passages and the extracts that they're going to listen to or read are actually very much related to or very connected to their professions. Now, when it comes to the score requirements for nurses in the USA, as recently announced, it's a 6.5 overall band score for IELTS, and and a 7 in the speaking component. Whereas for OET, it should be a grade of C plus for reading, writing, and listening, and a grade of B for speaking. Now, the reason for this is there's no overall score for OET. You only get individual scores for each one of the subtests and no overall score. So you get C plus for reading, writing, and listening, and B for speaking, because there's no overall score. In both IELTS and OET, there will definitely be some kind of human interaction, unlike the PTE, in which everything is going to be graded by the computer. In speaking, for example, for IELTS, you will be talking to an examiner who will be the one to assess your performance for the speaking examination. Whereas when you're taking OET, you're going to be talking to an interlocutor. Now, this person does not award a score to the candidate. Instead, the interlocutor facilitates the entire conversation, and the recording is the one that's going to be assessed by the examiners who are based in Melbourne, Australia. So all of the recordings are going to be sent over to Melbourne, Australia, and they're going to be assessed by examiners there. But certainly there will be some sort of personal interaction with another person when you're taking the IELTS or OET. IELTS takes on an interview for speaking, whereas in OET, it's going to be a role play. And you will be assuming the role of the healthcare provider, whereas the person that you're going to talk to is going to be an interlocutor, is going to assume the role of the patient.
Okay, thank you, Brian. And then I think there's just a little more there.
Yes. Well, a lot of our students are very interested to find out if they're able to have remarking for both the IELTS or OET. And yes, it is possible to challenge your scores. For IELTS, you have a window period of up to 6 weeks after you take the examination. But for OET, you have to do it as quickly as 72 hours after the release of the results. So you need to file for remarking much sooner if you're taking OET. So definitely, who are going to benefit from taking the IELTS? Those people perhaps who want to go abroad and want to take a general examination, a very comprehensive test for their English proficiency, and who want to take an examination that is accepted by literally all the countries in the world and all agencies and all institutions, because IELTS is more widely acceptable compared to other examinations. Whereas the OET is very beneficial for healthcare professionals who wish to work or who wish to live in an English speaking country, because the content of the examination is more relevant to them.
Okay, and then lastly, just a little bit of information
Yeah.
about the logistics.
Well, when we talk about the logistics, IELTS is definitely um, the best examination out of the three. When it comes to the locations, there are over 1,200 locations or test centers in more than 140 countries. In OET, we only have 160 worldwide. In fact, here in the Philippines, there are not really a lot of test centers for OET. So some of our students will have to travel from one place to another just to take the OET. So you have to check if there's a test center that's available near you when you're taking the OET, because there are more limited locations where the OET is being offered. Now, when it comes to the cost, and this is probably a lot, this is a very controversial topic, and a lot of people want to know how much the examination is going to be. While the IELTS and the PTE are almost the same in price, OET is significantly more expensive. It's 587 Australian dollars, or when converted to US dollars, around 400 US dollars. So that's quite expensive. It's almost twice the price of the IELTS. And you can pay for the IELTS through test centers. And here in the Philippines, for example, they accept bank deposits. And you can also use your credit card or PayPal to pay for your examination, depending on the test center. Whereas the OET requires a credit card for payment.
Okay, so Brian, that gives a very good comprehensive overview of the differences between the OET and the IELTS.